For me, it's a great pleasure. This is a really international seminar to introduce our next speaker, Professor Bernhard Preim from Magdeburg. He did his PhD there. He is the top expert in medical visualization, in visual computing for medicine, and using VR in medicine. After doing his PhD, he went on to Mewis in Bremen. This was and still is a very interesting place, very interdisciplinary. Really early on, people there were combining and highly interdisciplinary medical people, computer scientists, mathematicians, and other people. And since 2003, he moved back to Magdeburg and is a professor there. He has done a lot of community work initiated, for example, the VCBM, those people that are going to Laibach in September. Somebody here that's going to Laibach? Yeah, I mean, Bernhard is, I'm sorry. For me, it's Laibach. That's Bernhard has been instrumental in initiating this initiative. And some people call him the typewriter. And some people might say this is not nice to reduce his personality to a typewriter, but he is producing books with a velocity and speed that is incredible. And the last one one of the last that I remember, also Renata was involved as a co-author, but it was always Bernhard that is making sure that the people are doing their work. So it's a really great pleasure that you are here and that you are talking to us.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this kind invitation. Indeed, for the last book, I thought I'm old now. I need younger co-authors like Nuska and Renata and Kai. Yeah, my talk is entitled Science Communication and Narrative Medical Visualization. After a lot of work on medical visualization that aimed for physicians, surgeons, and radiologists, I was a bit exhausted from these topics and thought it would be more attractive to think about broader audiences, about patient education, for example, and that brought me to narrative visualization. And narrative visualization has a couple of pillars, too many to discuss all of them. I would like to discuss one of them, and that is science communication. Yeah, I find this increasingly important in these days because science communication, even for society, I think is quite important. What is science communication? Obviously, science communication involves to communicate scientific results. Yeah, there is a new discovery, the COVID virus, for example. What do we know about this? So the immediate scientific results should be part of science communication. But that is not enough. Yeah, as people doing science communication emphasize again and again, at least at a high level, you should also incorporate something about the scientific process, the discovery. How was it made? Yeah, which measurement devices were involved? They have a certain resolution, artifacts, noise, and so ever. So you get a bit of an understanding also how reliable something is or could be. Yeah, if you think about infectious diseases, for example, it's clear they are underreported. Probably the case numbers are not quite precise. So that also should be integrated in science communication. And finally, also the implications. Yeah, in science communication, one should also discuss what does this mean, what could be potential consequences. That's important. Yeah. Science communication is difficult because many scientific results are often not at all intuitive. Think of a simple example. You observe the sun goes down in one direction, and then you wake up and the sun approaches and emerges at another direction. So it is intuitive that the sun rotates around the earth. Yeah, that is what we observe with our naked eye, which would be plausible. Yeah, but that's not the case. If things develop in a linear manner, that is intuitive. Yeah, but exponential growth is not at all intuitive. You need a lot of effort to convince people of this, to convey this, to have good examples for this. Yeah, so scientific results often challenge common beliefs. In medicine, you know about the stomach can have an inflammation. Yeah, and it was thought that this is caused by stress. Yeah, you have too much stress in your life. You need to reduce this, and then you can avoid inflammations of the stomach. But that's only half of the truth. Actually, the inflammation is caused by a bacterium. So if you don't have this bacterium, no matter how many stress you have, you could not get stomach inflammation. That really challenged common beliefs at the time when this invention was meant. Yeah. So clear communication is really necessary. And yeah, that should help to build an understanding and finally let people to make informed decisions, for example, in the pandemics, and to develop the right amount of trust, not as much trust as possible, but the right amount. So I think it's fair to say that effective and good science communication bridges the gap between research, which often is rather complex, and everyday understanding. Yeah. So what is the major goal? To create shared meanings. And that is deeply important for modern societies, for democratic societies. Yeah. If the majority of the population of the public is not convinced of science, that would be very dangerous for societies as a whole. Yeah, and the definition is science communication is the science. That's interesting. Science communication is a science of developing, testing, and teaching strategies to convey science to children, students, and the general public. In science communication, often children are particularly emphasized because there is one additional goal compared to the general audience, namely to make people enthusiastic about science so that they want to become scientists themselves. Yeah, that's quite interesting. So if you think about this, it involves an understanding first of science. To do science communication, you should be an expert in a certain branch of science. It involves communication, and that's a lot about psychology, about emotions, about what is effective with A, not with E. Yeah. There is persuasive visualization, that is part of communication. And you need an understanding of public audiences, and in particular, what you can assume, what they are familiar with, what they could be interested in. So as a science, of course, science communication also has a foundation, and these are models. These relate, for example, to visual literacy, which is important for our field, but also to numeracy. Yeah, what kind of statistical information people can be assumed to understand, text comprehension. There would be a few others. Yeah, data literacy, health literacy is also important for us. So that is one essential part of science communication. And another one is empirical research, case studies from which you can generalize in a bottom-up manner. Yeah, and many of these case studies that are published in science communication journals relate to astronomy, biology, or chemistry. These are areas where many people are interested in. Yeah, so these are quite useful examples. Yeah, so in any kind of science, evaluation is important, assessment. If you have a piece of science communication, how do you know whether it is successful or not? Yeah. Here are a number of properties that are desirable. Yeah. So ideally, your science communication is comprehensive. Your attitude towards science gets more positive. Your curiosity is stimulated. You want to know more about the subject. You Google and do other things. Maybe it's even entertaining. Yeah. You want to tell it to your friends. Maybe it's considered as credible, yeah, often based on the sources on which it is based. For pupils, it may even motivate them to study science. Yeah, so you would make questionnaires and to understand to which extent these properties are fulfilled. Yeah, these are the positive properties. There could be also negative properties. Yeah, your science communication was not so particularly successful, so people get bored. They think, oh, there's too much data, too much bar charts, and I actually don't want to understand this. Or they can be confused, in particular because science often has results that are not intuitive. So to what extent confusion arises? Maybe a certain amount of confusion is not too bad because it stimulates to think once more. Yeah. If everything fits so easily and nicely, maybe that is not the best thing. Yeah. And of course, it may even happen that users are frustrated. Yeah, if they are motivated and want to understand something in a science museum, for example, or in a science documentation on TV, and there is something that's too difficult, okay, they think, I want to know this, I try harder. But if this happens several times, then they give up. They think, well, that's too high for us. too specialized, I cannot understand. They get frustrated. Yeah. So that's how science communication is assessed. There are many forms of science communication. Yeah. Dreisat is a joint thing between Germany and Austria. So therefore I use this example, just the most recent science documentations from Dreisat, 45 minutes each of them. So a broad spectrum of topics that are interested for the general public. Yeah, and there are other things like science books. When I was 12 years old, my father gave me as a present a book on the pioneers of the nuclear age. Max Planck, Albert Einstein, Heisenberg, and so on. Yeah, so I learned about these biographies, the discoveries, the context in which all this was made. So even this can be quite fascinating. Yeah. You know that some journals like the New York Times and Washington Post and Scientific American, yeah, that's a broad journal, are successful since decades in communicating science. I should not talk so much about science communication at TU Vienna because you know this much better than me. I really appreciate a lot what was done here, for example, by Peter Mindek in InfoGraphics. Yeah, really excellent pieces of science communication. And I admit that my own interest in narrative visualization and storytelling was triggered to a large extent by reviewing a PhD thesis here from TU Vienna, namely from David Kuril. Yeah, an excellent PhD thesis. Yeah, and I was happy to see that David was awarded with a Eurovis PhD award for this. Yeah, and that was quite close to my own area. Most of narrative visualization and storytelling relates to business data and charts and how to annotate them, which is also interesting, but not medical visualization. But here it was biology. That's quite close to medical visualization. Yeah, so when I reviewed this thesis, I basically did two things. On the one hand, to find some reasons to express my appreciation for the thesis. And the second was to think about what we should do in our group to do slightly similar things. Yeah, thinking in a very structured way about interaction, navigation, abstraction, if you have such large and complex data, labeling, using colors, and so on. Yeah, that brings me closer to narrative visualization. Yeah, in narrative visualization, you use stories. Storytelling is behind it. You can do storytelling just for entertainment purposes. Yeah, you want to entertain people, but there is also what is called serious storytelling when there is another reason, a deeper reason, perhaps, for storytelling. People remember stories very well. Most of what we know is based on stories that we were told. So it's really useful to base communication on stories. I cite here probably the most influential paper on science communication from Michael Dahlström, using narratives and storytelling to communicate science with non-expert audiences. Yeah, it has way over 1,000 citations. Yeah, narratives offer increased comprehension, interest, and engagement. Yeah, and they offer science communications tactics for persuading otherwise resistant audiences. So persuasion plays a role here. Yeah, science communication cannot be done in a completely neutral and only objective manner. Yeah, it is somehow subjective. Yeah, so what are narrative formats for science communication? There could be personal stories. Yeah, personalization can play a huge role in order to make users connect to the topic. Yeah, here, for example, in medicine, we can think about patients as the persons that are important, or physicians or relatives. Yeah, there could be case studies, so you don't emphasize a particular person so much, but a particular case. Yeah, how complex a diagnostic process was, how it finally was successful, and based on this, how a good treatment could be derived. Yeah, the hero's journey is an important narrative format that's widely used. So that is something that could be also interesting for science communication and also for narrative medical visualization. Stories often have a conflict, yeah, that makes it interesting. So there is a problem, a person that is threatened by a severe disease, for example, yeah, and then there is the scientific approach and how it can be applied to solve the problem, or it used to reduce the problem. Historical narrative may be quite important. Yeah, I mentioned this book that my father gave me early. So that involved a lot of historical narratives only with text. Yeah, the only images in this book were photos of these persons. Yeah, so one photo and then a 30-page chapter only with text. But even that was quite fascinating. Yeah, and of course, science fiction could also be an essential narrative format, yeah, to speculate about the future, what AI and other technologies may bring. Yeah, so when this is used in a careful manner, it really may help to inform and engage people. Yeah, so what about science narrative texts? Narrative always means that there is a sequence of actions and events that should be somehow logical. Yeah, how they follow each other. Yeah, a scientific biography has some logic. Did his PhD there and there, then did a postdoc there and there. Yeah, that would be a narrative. Maybe not too interesting, but a narrative. It provides context and relevance. Our own experience was that when we want to convey something and discuss this with the physicians, we need a lot of context to make people familiar with this, later to interpret. Yeah, we just thought, well, that's the most important and interesting piece of data we want to convey. And then it ends up with a lot more. Yeah, there are authors, they should be identifiable, recognizable. Science narrative text should contain familiar elements. Often metaphors are quite useful. A metaphor that I found frequently is the iceberg metaphor. Yeah, so there is a visible part of a problem that is more or less obvious with the naked eye. We can observe it, and then there is a larger part of things that are hidden and needs to be uncovered. Yeah, and of course, these texts should be created in a way that lead to an empathic reaction. Yeah, that trigger some emotion, and that may improve attention and focus attention better than traditional science text without these story characters. So we are at the Institute of Visual Computing. Yeah, of course, we want to talk about visualization. Helwig already mentioned the picture superiority effect. That is an important observation. Yeah, I used this to transform all my slides in a form that is as visual as possible. Yeah, I think if I preach visual communication, I try to do it as good as possible. So that's an experiment for me. I didn't do it so often. Yeah. So pictures are valuable. Animations are quite valuable. Good transitions, as Helwig mentioned. Yeah. So these are types of visualizations that are successfully used in science stories. You see that this paper here from Salmon, that's an old paper, yeah, but even in 2002, that was recognized, and I think it's a quite useful paper, yeah. So visualization in science stories may enhance understanding, capture attention, improve memory over a longer time, builds empathy and connection, and support communication. These two things are closely related and may increase motivation to learn. Learning without motivation just will not happen. Yeah, if you want to convey something and people have no emotions with it, they will not learn anything. Yeah. Helwig also mentioned infographics, and in what I researched, they play an important role. They are used in scientific communications, of course, a lot. They are, usually we have these textual abstracts. Yeah, that's what we all know, but increasingly we also have visual abstracts. These are infographics. Yeah. I want to briefly comment on one paper that I found quite interesting, where it was investigated how helpful visual abstracts are for physicians to cope with the exploding literature in their medical subfield. Yeah. Still, I would say that visual summaries or graphical abstracts are a rather recent trend. Actually, they were introduced quite early, namely in 1976. There was a chemistry journal where it was mandatory from this time on to submit a visual abstract. It's not something that Joaquim Jorge has invented with computers and graphics, yeah, but it was there at least 30 years earlier. And in many medical journals, it is mandatory as well. For example, the Annals of Surgery is one of the most famous medical journals. And 10 years before, they said you should submit a visual abstract. I find this quite nice. Yeah. So the goal is to summarize the essence of the research quickly and clearly to improve basically the discoverability of the research. So of course it takes a lot of effort to make good visual abstracts. Yeah. But currently with AI, that can be done much faster and maybe even with a better quality, which should be the more important goal. Yeah. So here is a recommended graphical abstract. If you go to the Elsevier homepage, they have advice how you should create your visual abstracts. Yeah, they propose certain schemas and strategies, and that is some of the examples that they recommend. Yeah, so that has a number of advantages, as I think I already commented. Of course, there is some effort involved in creating them. This paper here from Martin analyzed the perception of visual abstracts. Yeah. So here was one of the examples that they used in their study. And they asked physicians about the reader preference, textual abstract versus visual abstract. And they tried to assess the perceived mental effort. They did this with 112 Canadian emergency physicians. And they were provided with 4 infographics, visual abstracts, and 4 text-only summaries. The infographics were created together with an experienced designer, so they had a good quality. That's certainly important. Yeah, the result was quite clear. The physicians clearly preferred the visual abstracts 8 times more. That's a lot. And they clearly consider the visual abstracts cognitively easier. That is what could be shown. What could not be shown is that the memorability over a longer time was indeed better. Yeah, that was only a slight trend, but not a significant result. Yeah, so the visual abstracts are preferred and perceived as easier to process. Yeah, everything else is not quite clear. That was one of the examples that they used in their study. They were optimized for the smartphone. Yeah, so these long form infographics that have, they are quite tall, but not so wide. Yeah, let's come to narrative visualization. Yeah, the pioneering work here is from Siegel and Hör. Stories are used to convey something. Storytelling is combined with interactive graphics. I fully agree with Helwig that interaction is really important and instrumental. Yeah, and it aims here at broad audiences. The strategies and tactics are used from journalism. Siegel and Hör basically analyzed pieces from the New York Times, from journalism. You can read papers about data videos through the lens of cinematography. So it becomes immediately clear that is inspired by the cinema. Yeah, and other things are more inspired by theater and literature. Narrative visualization is very design oriented. Yeah, so sketching, prototyping, refinement, that plays a large role there. Yeah, so you have stories, you integrate them with interactive graphics designed in a way that is appropriate for broader audiences. Yeah, and you evaluate whether understanding and engagement really are improved with this. Yeah, once more, the major sources for this: literature, theater, journalism, film, and this design thinking. Yeah, people in design, we have some PhD students that did a master in interaction design before. Yeah, they really think very carefully about the target audience, requirements, constraints of the solution space, and so on. This kind of thinking is very helpful here. Yeah, so what are some essential design decisions here? Maybe the first and maybe even the most important one is the narrative intent. Why this all matters? What is it good for? Yeah, what is the key message of your science communication? In our case studies, it is often that we want to make people aware not only of a disease and how often it occurs and so on, but about the avoidable risk factors. There are also non-avoidable risk factors, but why should people care about the non-avoidable risk factors? But maybe they care a bit about the avoidable risk factors. And sometimes our narrative intent is just to increase the awareness for a disease, which may be rather rare, which is not so obvious. That could be another example. But one should be really clear about this narrative intent first. Then you need context. Yeah, you need to integrate what you want to say in a little bit broader context. You need to think about how to hook the audience. Then you collect story pieces. Yeah, what needs to be part of your story. Grouping and sequencing is quite important. Jessica Hullman writes nice papers about this. Yeah, and you combine this with appropriate data facts. You create medical stories. You really think a lot about your data sources and how credible they are. Yeah, that should be part of a narrative medical visualization. Which data were used to create this? Yeah, and then you may use some narrative design patterns. There is a very good summary of them in a book chapter where Benjamin Bach is the first author, about 18 narrative design patterns. The first one is a rhetoric question. That is something we use very often to raise interest, hopefully. Yeah, we need visualization techniques and interaction support. Yeah, simple rotations, zooming done in a very simple manner. Visual representations like icons. We are in Vienna here, so we appreciate a lot Otto Neurath and the related developments on pictographs. Yeah, and then we embed all this in narrative structures. Yeah, often with a lot of iteration. The narrative structure can be linear. That is quite simple. It's also very good from the perspective of the author, because then I really can rely. If my user is here and looks at step 3, they have already seen step 1 and 2. Yeah. If this would be completely free and they can do whatever they want, you cannot rely on this. Yeah. So a linear structure is often a good basis. However, people have not exactly the same prerequisites and interests. So we often realize something that is called an elastic structure, which means that you have this linear backbone, but optionally you can deviate from this. For example, in a medical story, you can get a slide that explains to you how a computer tomography works or magnetic resonance imaging, and then you return back automatically to this backbone. Yeah. What we have not investigated so well so far is how much of this elasticity is useful. So if we have 16 slides, should we have 3 or 4 possibilities to deviate, or 10 or 12? That is something I cannot say in the moment. The Martini glass structure is something already suggested by Siegel and Her. So a story can be created in such a way that there is a linear path first, where the author really can ensure that people get familiar with certain things, but then later there are more interaction options. Yeah, if you are more interested in this, you can do this, and so on. Yeah, that is quite useful, I think. Yeah, so grouping. Of course, you often have an introduction. Yeah, you may introduce your characters if characters are important, and the conflict. Then the tension rises somehow. The conflict becomes really severe. Maybe the cancer patient has to undergo surgery, and he's very, very anxious before this. That could be a peak. And finally, the conflict is resolved and the characters succeed, hopefully, or failed. Yeah, that would be one grouping strategy. Here's a medical application where we tried to use Aristoteles' tension arc. Yeah, we introduce characters, a patient and a physician often. The disease often means the major conflict. Then we have the peak, the denouement, and then also some data-driven aspects, often more at the end, not initially. Yeah. So to raise interest, it's not very useful to show 5 bar charts. Yeah, so we want to focus on areas where there is a broad interest. In general, I think there is a broad interest in health topics because many of us may be affected by them. We also think about patient education, among others, because our physicians are telling us that is really important for them. They want to have patients better informed before they discuss with them the treatment options, for example. Yeah, that involves a lot of risk communication. Yeah, there are certain treatments, they all have risks and side effects, and people should make informed decisions considering these risks. Yeah, some of our stories relate more to medical treatment. Yeah, but we also want to convey scientific results. For example, new diagnostic processes that involve cardiac blood flow data, for example. If I summarize a little bit the narrative intents that we follow, these can be summarized as follows. Sometimes the medical research institutions wanted to create as something, data, videos, or PowerPoint slides to attract funding or patients, if it's a private hospital, or participants in studies. Yeah, they need to do research, they need participants for their studies, and that is as difficult as getting reviewers for a journal article. So you need really support with this. Yeah. For the patient, it's important that they can be better informed. A landmark paper that I have read about this was from 1919, where a group of cardiologists investigated whether they can prepare patients better for cardiac surgery with cartoons. Yeah. And they could show that this was really the case. They were more compliant later. They respected that they should not carry heavy things and so on. So they could show that this was more effective than the traditional way of preparing them. Yeah. So, and for the general population, our goal is, as I said, to avoid, to inform people about avoidable risk factors. Yeah, maybe to strengthen their willingness to adapt their lifestyle in a healthy manner, to make them aware of available checkups. So if a disease cannot be prevented, at least it should be detected as early as possible. Yeah. So these are some of the narrative intents that underlie our stories. Yeah. So it's a design approach that we follow. We carefully discuss the narrative intent and then all the other steps of creating narrative visualizations. We think a lot about this personalization aspect. Yeah. It's not clear that this is the solution to everything. It is also not clear how to do it exactly. Yeah. How to visually represent a patient, for example, how realistic, and in which stages. Yeah, but that is something we often take into account. Meanwhile, our patient characters are AI generated. Yeah, also for ethical reasons, it's not so easy to find real patients. Yeah, but we can generate AI patients with desired characteristics, even how they develop over time. And even in a reproducible manner, so that we really can say with this prompt, you really get this result. Yeah. So then we select a narrative strategy. One of my PhD students, Sarah, came up with the idea of transforming Campbell's hero journey, which is a known storytelling approach, to our applications, and she called this the patient hero journey. Yeah. So in her stories, the patient is the hero, and in a structure similar to Campbell's hero story, the structure unfolds. Yeah. We try to incorporate features that raise trust. For example, we explain with which university hospitals we have collaborated. Often we have indeed images of the physicians, professors of medicine, that validated the whole content, which is certainly important here. Yeah, and we also try to make sure that we employ data from generally available sources that are not biased towards the interest, let's say, of a drug company. Yeah. So that is our overall approach. Yeah, the evaluation here is completely different than a usual visualization evaluation, where you look for task completion time and accuracy and error rates. Yeah, it's more about how much people have learned when they are confronted with a piece of narrative medical visualization, what they can remember, how much they trust, engagement and willingness to change behavior. Engagement is an interesting thing. Engagement ideally would be analyzed when people are in the process of seeing something and interacting with something. Usually it's assessed only after the story, self-reported data. Was this motivating for you? Yeah, and the major things appeared half an hour before, and even we have a tension arc. We want to modulate the engagement. Yeah, but we ask for a summary, a general summary. Yeah, that's not ideal. But yeah, that's what is usually done. Yeah, as already mentioned, the classic visualization criteria are not very helpful here. Yeah, the patient's disease journey works as this. Yeah, the departure, the patient leaves his normal life because he has severe symptoms and yeah, needs to understand what is the problem. Then there are many examinations and tests. Yeah, there could be physical reasons, there could be mental reasons. Often it's a combination of both. Yeah, that needs to be understood. And finally, after treatment, the patient hopefully may return to his normal life as much as possible. Yeah, that was a Eurovis paper that we had 3 years before. So the specific example was we wanted to inform people about the small vessel disease. Have you heard about the small vessel disease? No. Yeah, most people not, but it's a frequent disease, but it's not very familiar. People are not aware of this. And then you could say, well, maybe it's not so important. After the small vessel disease often follows vascular dementia or Alzheimer. That's the precursor of this, the condition that makes it very likely that you develop this. Yeah. So therefore, people should know about this. Yeah, in the story here, we inform how often this occurs. There are different subtypes. What are the symptoms? Yeah, we consequently use these pictographs from Otto Neurer to convey, yeah, how often appears something. And yeah, that can be visually explained if you have really high resolution medical image data. We have 7 Tesla MRI data so that you can see some of the small vessels and how they are damaged. Basically, what happens there is if many small vessels are damaged by some deposits, yeah, this adds up and later leads to vascular dementia or Alzheimer. So, and I told you that we are so interested in avoidable risk factors. The avoidable risk factor here is very clear. It's just one. It's high blood pressure. Yeah. So the takeaway message that comes on the next slide is that you should control your blood pressure. And if it is too high, you really should do something, even if you still feel well. Yeah. You have no major symptoms. Yeah. But you may already have a problem. I told you about this elastic structure. So here, for example, the explanation of an MRI, that was an optional part. That's not absolutely necessary, but it's part of the story that you can have a look at this. Just one impression of character generation. Yeah, so these characters here are AI generated. We wanted to give them certain expressions. Yeah, maybe they are angry because they have heard about they have fatty liver disease, for example. Yeah, so here we created a 65-year kindergarten teacher with fatty liver disease. And that is 5 years later. So now she is 70, but she has lost weight. Also, her fatty liver disease was reduced strongly. So that should be the same character. And we developed this character because we looked in a large medical database and we found an example for her. Yeah, I would say. So a person that was observed over several stages, how she developed the disease and finally get rid of the disease. Yeah, so that is what we tried to visualize. Yeah, we have male and female characters first created with Leonardo AI, but the major problem there was that is not reproducible. With the same prompt, you would not get the same result. With stable diffusion, we finally get the best results. Yeah. Yeah, of course, that involves ethical questions. Yeah, avoiding stigmatization and stereotypes, obese people, for example. Yeah, so that is involved here. One of our visual stories, by the way, that's the website where we collect them, visualstories.cs.ovgu.de. That was the journal title. Is there a tornado in Alex' blood flow? So we asked our physician from Heart Center Leipzig, how do you explain a patient that his condition is really severe and needs treatment, usually heart valve repair? Yeah. severe treatment? Well, he said, I explained them, your blood flow is so disturbed that is as if you would have a tornado in your blood flow. Yeah, again, metaphors could be quite useful for communication with broad audiences. We chose Alex as a gender neutral name. Yeah, Alex could be a man or a woman. Yeah, just one more example, explanation of vision restoration. We have in Magdeburg a top expert on vision restoration, Professor Sabel. He has a clinic almost only with international patients. And he tries to cure patients that have severe vision loss that is not based on a retinal disease, but by reduced blood flow in the retinal vessels. Yeah, they need to be stimulated, electrostimulation. They also need mental treatment. Yeah, that has a stress component. If people have a hearing loss, yeah, it's clear to everybody, they had too much stress. But if your vision is strongly reduced, that may have the same reason, which is not so familiar. Yeah. So here are some examples of what Beatrice Budig created in a video. Maybe for the sake of time, we don't look at the video, but I'm happy to share the slides with you. So then you would have the link with it. She really tries to explain the normal retinal blood supply, how it may be disturbed if there is what they call a mini stroke. Yeah. And how this may be later treated and improved. So that was an example of a work where I would say that was very design oriented, that was very specialized to this particular use case. But of course, I'm a computer scientist. Yeah, we are looking for the computer science research in it. So we try to identify reusable components, structures, strategies, and so on. So in our first paper with Monique Moischke as first author, we developed a template for making a disease story. And indeed, 4 years later, I can say that template was, at least for us, very useful. We have applied and adapted it several times, but as a basic structure, we can use it for communicating primarily diseases. Yeah, we also use this patient hero's journey as an overall structuring idea quite often. Pictograph we use quite often. We have did a lot of experiments in how can we create maybe create is the best word, simple interaction techniques with 3D medical data. Yeah, very restricted, only in one direction, so that users don't get confused with the viewing direction they do not understand. We thought about simple label techniques. We have not thought so far about creating figure captions. In my PhD thesis, I created automatically figure captions for 3D visualizations. Yeah, and if you get older, you fall in love with things you did 30 years before. So maybe we can do something similar also for narrative visualization. And also animation is more a kind of future work than something that we have already did. To conclude, yeah, for narrative medical visualization, we try to improve health literacy, because improved health literacy is strongly correlated with better health. We have to carefully think about our target audiences. And just an observation here, when preparing my lecture, I found that the World Health Organization has a collection of 1,300 very carefully designed infographics for various medical topics. Yeah, so that is understood as something really useful. My future work slide. We need better evaluation of engagement. Yeah, I mentioned already the self-reported data alone is not very appropriate. In our last work, we combined it with electrodermal activity measurements. Yeah, so then you can really see how things change. You can see peaks and this. And if you integrate this measurement with the self-reported data, that may be a quite useful source of information. That is the major topic of our conditionally accepted paper for the WIS conference. The initial tendency was here. We created different variants of stories, and stories may benefit from integrating a character in the initial stage. Later, it may be useful to argue more on a population level, to integrate statistics and so on. But in the initial stages, it may be very useful to integrate a character. We want to focus more on families of diseases instead of single diseases. So, for example, can we come up with general strategies for informing about cancer diseases and cancer treatment? Yeah. The first step would be to think about what the general audience probably knows already about cancer, what we can assume. Yeah. Vascular diseases would be another example for a quite important family of diseases. Yeah, so with this, I want to thank my team with slight gender bias. So that's the team in Magdeburg, Luisa, Sarah, Monique, Sophie, Anjali, and Beatrice, and our major collaborators, Laura in Bergen and Veronika, who is an interaction design professor at the Hochschule Rhein-Main in Wiesbaden. I'm still here until July 9. Yeah, you may contact me. I'm sitting there where Johanna was sitting before. If you are interested in the slides, please write me an email. I'm happy to share them with you. Yeah, of course, I have references. I emphasize them in two different ways. The most important things about science communication are just in bold, and the red ones are those from our group. Yeah. If nothing else, is remembered, this paper here is really strong from Michael Dahlström. I commented already on the title once. Yeah. And maybe here is another one that I like a lot from Kwan Liu-Ma and Helwig. Yeah, so this 2007 paper was followed by another one in 2012, 11, what I also like a lot and yeah, inspired me. Yeah, and here is one other that is quite interesting. Science stories and science texts. What can we do? Can they do for our students' studies in science education? Yeah, I sometimes find it interesting which journal titles exist. Yeah, studies in science education. I'm at the end of the talk. Thanks a lot for surviving this at this temperature. Danke, Helwig. That's so kind.
Thank you very much, Bernhard, for this very, very informative talk. We have time for questions, comments.
Mhm. She's engaged in the
question about the evaluations.
Mhm.
The setting usually in these kind of studies, I assume, is you confront the people with different variations.
Exactly. Yeah. Of the same
after
story.
evaluations prepared,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
you have your measures there.
Yeah.
Have you also considered, or is this an area you're also interested in, how to initially attract the attention of
Mhm.
people? Because I think that's a major thing. If we see like how
Yeah.
social media works, for instance, it's very like a lot is how to grab the attention.
Very good idea.
initially. And
I have seen this. I prepared a lecture for my students on infographics. And there I found research, I think at the Kai paper in 2015, how to support these initial 0.5 seconds where people already decide whether or not that's something that they should take a look more at. Yeah. So at least for the infographics community, there is some research on this. That is a highly cited paper, so there is follow-up work from others. Yeah, yeah.
Further questions, comments?
So Bernhard, many thanks. This was, as usual, very, very interesting and a lot also.
Thanks.
Maybe I start with just a comment. You repeatedly mentioned this highly cited paper by Dahlström. I must say I disagree with the notion of a non-expert, and it took me a while to realize this, but I now think there is nothing like a non-expert. Everyone is an expert in something.
Yeah, that's true.
What
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's just a different way of thinking about the word. That's a comment, not a question.
I agree with the comment.
I have a question, and that is, you talked about visual abstracts for a few slides. Very, very interesting. I think they are effective. We have teaser images. For example,
exactly.
in our papers. One thing that you didn't talk about is, did those researchers also look into the question whether there is some oversimplification happening in the visual abstract? I mean, sometimes there is no risk of that, but sometimes you need the footnotes in order to make a correct statement. And if you leave them out in visual abstract, maybe you oversimplify it. Did they look into that?
I have not seen this, but clearly there is a danger that this may happen.
Further questions, comments?
Mm.
Dr. Matkovic, Peter.
Mm. Mm.
Thanks, Meister.
Mm.
I have this is not a question to you, Bernhard, so don't worry.
Yeah.
It's more like an idea for Michi
Mm.
as associated editor, as chief editor-in-chief of CGF.
Mm.
And because we learned visual abstracts are quite old
Mm.
in other journals. As far as I know, CGF doesn't have it. But now to be innovative and to be again in forefront, you could introduce interactive visual abstract, merging the two talks which we heard, and solving the Helwig's problem of oversimplification. So with interaction, we can avoid oversimplification, and we solve all the problems. More a comment.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, CGF papers have teasers usually, so that's kind of a visual abstract.
Yeah.
And the interactive part would probably be cool, but most people who care about their work now have their own GitHub IO pages and so on, where they put all the interactive elements anyway. But and we would have to maintain it on the InfoGraphics digital library and on the Wiley page. And I'm sure the Wiley page is so. I mean, I have to deal with the new Wiley review system, and it's so terrible.
Yeah, it is.
And there's just no way to change anything. And yeah, that would be very frustrating. But in general, it sounds like a very interesting idea. I mean, there's in machine learning, there's this, I don't know, there's this interactive kind of online journal by Google or so, where you always have these interactive actually papers. Every figure is based on data. That's very nice. A bit hard to implement.
Wo kommen wir hin?
Maybe
So the long to compress the answer, Gresho. No.
Could you comment upon whether or not you looked into adapting your story designs in order to meet the users where they are? I remember, I think in the beginning of this century, David Ebert and colleagues, they worked on what they think they called it motives. They had this idea that the interface should adapt to the level of literacy or the level of expertise of the people. Did you look into that? Because when you talk about broader audiences, you have a wide variety of viewers or users of your stories. Did you look into that?
That's a very good question, and what must be said first is the broad audience is not homogeneous at all. Yeah, it is really very heterogeneous. You can assume a certain minimum level of competence in certain areas, but of course most users are better than this: numeracy, visual literacy, data literacy, and so on. So it would be absolutely appropriate to do this. Yeah, we have not done this. Probably we are not so far with really spreading our visualizations and our pieces of science communication. Then we would have a higher Leidensdruck. Cannot say this so good in English. Yeah, it would become obvious that some people would have comments in this direction. So probably this is something that you only reach when you really spread your work a lot. Yeah.
Helmut?
Yeah, so maybe a follow-up question to Helwig and Manuela at the beginning about how to grab the attention. So maybe you could also think about like how different generations have different attention spans, right? Like the youngest generation, I mean, if I look at my nephew, anything longer than 60 seconds, he gets bored, right? He doesn't want.
Yeah.
So while we were reading 30 pages of text about like our ancestors, how that would influence maybe future.
That certainly would have an influence. However, for medical topics, honestly, the audience that is interested is not the youngest one. Yeah, those affected by health problems are typically a bit older.
I have a follow-up. do you know any studies? Because there are different learning persons. Like I'm absolutely annoyed if I have to watch a video. Like I just don't want to do that. I want to see a comic or a text or whatever. Are there studies on this? Which kind of visualization works better on these people?
I'm not aware of this. I have not seen this.
People would hope that I stop it now, but I will ask a question myself. So, Humboldt, Humboldt, he was talking about the unity of research and teaching.
Yeah, I was at Humboldt School.
Which one, the Alexander or the brother?
It was the brother Humboldt School. They could not decide.
Both of them. And people like Anders Zimmermann are talking about combining exploration, science, and explanation.
That's a nice paper.
And
Yeah, exactly.
Also, I think that in the future, research and communication should be united in a way. So that people are not writing papers, are not producing videos. They do their research and combine everything in a knowledge graph. And then the systems make a paper out of it, a short paper, a video, a podcast. So I think that would be sort of going from a PDF, a portable document format, to a portable knowledge format.
That sounds good.
Do you think
that sounds good? And it triggers one more thought in me, maybe not directly related to your question. I think that narrative visualization can be useful also for experts and will be useful also for them. Yeah, in the past, we have created incredibly complex user interfaces for a few top experts, and probably even for them it was too complex, but for a user study, somehow it worked. Yeah, even they need simpler things, simpler interactions. Yeah, so hopefully with the goal of doing something for broader audiences, as a side effect, we can also do something that can be adapted for the experts. A little bit like if a building is made for people in Rollstuhl, yeah, that's also quite useful if you have your suitcase or your Kinderwagen. Yeah, so initially you do something for a certain group, but it is useful also for others. That's what I hope.
Any more comments?
Exploration was cool. Yeah.
I want to talk about food. So we're going for lunch with our guests. Who would want to join? Oi, 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 oi.
Yeah.
Oi, oi. Now. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, many people. Okay. Then we.
There's a garden.
Yeah. Okay. Then let's start at Wiedenboy and
10 minutes.
Yeah. Half past 12.
Thank you, Edi. So I'm still Manuela, and I would like to thank our guests. I think these have been two very inspirational talks. But it's even better after the lunch they're giving demos. So one-on-one, you can talk to them, tell about your problems, your financial problems, and they're supposed to solve that. But it's even you even get more. They will be here, Bernhard, until the 9th of July, and Helvig even a little bit longer. Helvig next week not. If you want to talk to these people, I mean, they cannot run away. At the large conference,
exactly.
They can run away, but here they cannot. You have the opportunity really to talk to top experts in a one-on-one discussion. Use this opportunity, write them an email, and we will force them.
Or just come to my office.
Yeah. Because I mean, when you were talking about education requires motivation, also negative motivation, frightening people, I think can be a good motivator. With that, I think I conclude this historic TV. And I'm Manuela Waldner, and Edi will go for lunch with these. Thank you.
Ja, danke dir, dass du das machst.